Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. So I've been building this shed that you see behind me for several months now. Actually started in the middle of August and it's now the middle of November. And I'm not quite done. I still need to do the soffits, put some doors on it, paint it, and build some ramps. But since it's almost winter time and I've got other projects that I need to do around the house before the snow flies, I think what I'm going to do is winterize this project and finish it in the spring. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about some mistakes that I've made along the way and share them with you guys so that hopefully if you're tackling a project like this, you won't make the same mistakes that I did. The first mistake that I made was not paying enough attention to what the landscaper was doing when I had the shed pad put in. Now I talked about this in detail in another video, but basically what happened was I had a landscaper here doing some other work, and sort of as part of the job, he agreed to put this shed pad in for me. I told him kind of what I wanted and how big I wanted it, and he more or less did that. But what I didn't expect that he would do is dig into the bank over here. I really thought the ground was a little flatter than it really was. And I wouldn't say he necessarily did anything wrong here. I just wish that he would have kind of mentioned to me what was going on before he did it. But either way, you can see here that where I'm standing is, I don't know, 8 or 10 inches below the top of the grade there. But what he ended up doing, and it came out pretty well, is he dug out over here, and then he took the material that he dug out and he built it up over on this side, and he made a nice flat level shed pad. But one of the things that he didn't do was when he spread the gravel out on top of it for me, he didn't really have enough gravel to finish the job. I ended up having to bring in some more gravel and kind of fill in over here, and that's why it's two different colors. So the moral of the story with the shed pad is you get what you pay for. Now there's actually nothing wrong with it. It's doing the job, it's holding up the shed, and it's relatively level and where I wanted it, the size I wanted it, that kind of a thing. But it's not exactly what I wanted, and part of that's my fault. I didn't probably communicate as well as I should have up front, and I didn't come out when the landscaper was doing the job. Now again, he didn't charge me a ton of money for this because he was already here doing other work, so I think overall I really can't complain about it. So the next problem that I ran into was with the material for the shed floor. Now when I priced everything out, everything was available, and I decided to go one night after work to Lowe's and pick it up. Now one of the things I needed, of course, was 3/4 inch plywood, as you can see here. Now before I left to go, I checked the inventory of the store and they had plenty of 3/4 inch plywood. But what I didn't count on is when I got there, it was up on the upper shelf and somebody needed to get the fork truck to bring it down. Well, you know, all things being equal, I was in a bit of a hurry that evening and I really didn't want to wait around for somebody. They were a little short-staffed, so I ended up going home empty-handed. And what I decided to do was put my order in online the next morning, figuring that somebody could pick it during the day when they had time and it would be ready for me to pick up whenever I wanted. That seemed like a great plan, so that's what I did. And I got to Lowe's, all my stuff was ready for me to pick up, and they even helped me load it in my trailer, so I thought everything was great. Now, it took me a week or two to build the frame with all the floor joists and stuff before I got to the plywood. Well, when I got to the plywood and started putting pieces on, I put the first one on, no problem. And my 10-year-old son was out here kind of helping me. And I went to put the second piece on, I got it lined up, and he says to me, "Hey Dad, why is the second piece thinner than the first one?" So I looked at it and realized it was the wrong thickness. So I had ordered 8 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood. And of course, they loaded it for me, so I didn't see every piece as it was getting loaded in the trailer. And one of them must have been mixed in the wrong bin in the store. And the guys that, you know, picked it and loaded it didn't realize it. And of course, I didn't realize it until I went to use it. And at that point, I had no recourse. I couldn't even return it because the receipt that I had said that I had 3/4 inch plywood, not 1/2 inch or whatever it was. So I'm stuck with a piece of pressure treated plywood that I didn't need and couldn't use for this project. Now I'll put it to use at some point, so no big deal, but I ended up having to drive back down to Lowe's and get another piece to finish the floor. Needless to say, I wasn't too happy, but again, although, you know, they screwed up at the store, I kind of blame myself for not fully checking things. So from this point on, I didn't order anything else online. I went to the store and picked everything myself, even if it meant waiting for somebody to get stuff off the top shelf, which I had to do a couple of times. So the next problem that I ran into had to do with these wall studs. Now, after I had gotten the floor built, I figured out how many 2x4s I'd need for the walls and decided to take a ride again to Lowe's and pick those up. And again, you'll kind of hear this as a common theme as we go through all these mistakes I made, but I was in a hurry again. So I got to Lowe's, found the 2x4s, checked the price, everything looked okay, loaded a bunch of them into my cart, checked out, went on my way. When I got home and started to build the walls, I measured out what I needed for the length of my studs. And I realized that all the studs I had bought were shorter than 8 feet. These were actually, I guess, 92.5-inch long, which is a common product. They sell it at Lowe's. And it didn't end up being a problem because I think I cut these down to 86.5. The only real problem was that these cost about 30 or 40 cents more than a regular 2x4. And I wanted the extra scrap from the end of the 2x4 for other things. So because these were a little shorter, I didn't have a long enough piece of scrap that I wanted and ended up having to buy more 2x4s later than I originally planned on. So not a huge deal, but again, if I had been paying attention when I was getting stuff at the store, I would have got what I wanted. But at the end of the day, I think this may have worked out better because when I went back to the store again for another trip, I realized that these 92.5-inch studs looked better and straighter than the regular 8-footers. So maybe at the end of the day, this worked out better and I got straighter walls because of it. Who knows? So I did all my framing on this shed with screws. And another mistake I made was starting off with this cordless drill that I have. And it worked okay, but it was slow and it was a bit much for this drill. And it's working now, but at one point along the way, I ended up stripping this out internally and it was just not a good tool for the job. So after I stripped out the drill, I figured it was time to run out and get a proper tool, this impact driver. And this really sped things up and made driving the screws a whole lot easier. And people even in the comments section of one of the videos I posted were questioning why I was using a regular cordless drill instead of an impact driver like this. And they were right. This sure made the job a lot easier. So when I first started thinking about laying out the roof on the shed, I wanted to match my house, which happens to be a 6/12 pitch. But when I started laying this shed out, because of the 12-foot span, it just seemed a little too shallow and I thought it was going to look weird. So I ended up bumping it up to a 7/12 pitch, which I didn't think would really be that much of a difference. But boy, it sure did make a difference. Now over on the house, I have no problem getting on the roof and walking around up there as I need to. But that extra little bit of slope on this shed roof made it so that I couldn't walk up there without some kind of ladder or something to grab onto. I'm happy with the way that the shed looks and the way that the roof came out, but building a roof with a pitch that I couldn't walk around on was way more time consuming and way more work than I anticipated. So had I realized that when I laid things out, I might have done a shallower pitch on the roof. Now, another thing that I didn't do with the roof trusses, not yet anyway, was to put vertical collar tiles in between the stringer and the rafter on the truss to help kind of distribute the weight of the roof a little bit. Now, the reason I didn't do that is because I'm working on this thing 100% by myself. And I knew I needed to lift these things up by myself and kind of deal with them. So I wanted to keep them sort of as light as I possibly could. And that worked out. I was able to put those up there without too much trouble. So what I'll probably end up doing is when I get back to this thing in the spring, I'll go back and put some collar ties in. I don't think there's going to be any issues with it through the winter with it the way that it is. The roof is pretty sturdy. I've been crawling around up there and there's no issues, but just over time, I think putting some collar ties in there is going to help distribute the load and keep this roof from sagging, 20, 30 years down the road. So another mistake I made with the shed build, and it was, I guess, kind of unavoidable since I'm working on this by myself after work and on the weekends when I had a few hours to spare, and that is that some of this wood sat exposed to the elements while I was building this thing and started to get a little bit black and moldy. Now, in the spring, before I finish the shed off, I'm going to try and power wash some of this inside and get some of that mold off. But now that the roof is on and everything is dry inside, it should stop spreading. And that brings me to the biggest mistake that I made so far on this shed. And that has to do with the plywood that I used on the roof the first time around. So what ended up happening, again, I was in a bit of a hurry and I went down to Lowe's again and I got the plywood that I was going to use for the roof. So when I walked in the store, I went up the plywood aisle and looked for the exterior plywood sheathing. I found a bin that was labeled that and the thickness that I wanted, and I loaded up my cart, bought it, brought it home. So I ended up cutting about half of it and getting it up on the shed roof and installed before a rainstorm came through. So I let it sit overnight. We had rain come through. The next morning I went out to take a look at the shed and maybe start working on it again. And all the plywood that was up on the roof had warped and delaminated. So it clearly was not exterior grade plywood, or it wasn't made right. Now, there were two mistakes made, one by me and one by the plywood manufacturer. And to explain that in a little more detail, let's go take a look at that plywood, because I still have it here. So here's a look at the plywood I was talking about, and this is one of the worst pieces, but you can see what happened. All the layers came delaminated, and actually this is flatter than it was when it was wet, but now that it's been sitting in the cellar, it's kind of dried out and flattened. But this was all buckled and warped when it was up on the roof, and there was no way I was going to be able to shingle over that and have it kind of stay together over time. So I pulled all this plywood off and started over with the right stuff. So here's where I went wrong. As you can see here, this stuff is rated as exterior plywood and it's the right thickness. But down here, you can see that it says that this is underlayment. This is actually for underlaying floors and not to be used on the roof. Now, having said that, it shouldn't have warped and come apart after just one rainstorm. It should have been fine up there. And what I'm told is that this would have been fine up on the roof. It just isn't as strong as regular roof sheathing would be, and actually cost a fair bit more than regular roof sheathing does. So here's a look at the right stuff. This is what's up on the roof now. And you can see the stamp on it says that it's rated sheathing, not underlayment. And this one happens to be stamped exposure 1. Now this is maybe, I guess, one level below exterior, but it should survive a couple of rainstorms while you're in the middle of a building project before it's covered up with siding or shingles. Now, I should have returned all this plywood. I would have gotten credit. I did call the store and complain. They told me I could bring it back and they'd refund me, but I never got around to it. I got distracted with work and other life events, and I just never got around to getting to the store. And I've had this stuff for almost 2 months now, so probably lost my window of opportunity. Now, for the most part, most of the sections of the plywood are good, so I'll just set this stuff over the corner and I'll use it for other projects at some point and take my loss as a learning experience. And next time, I'll get the right plywood for the job. So here's another kind of small mistake that I made. Once I got all my drip edge up here and I started putting my ladder up to do the shingling, I leaned the ladder up against the edge of my drip edge and dented it pretty good in a couple of spots. Now luckily, I only did that back here on the back of the shed, so nobody's ever going to see this. Once I realized I did that, I got some scrap 2x4s and screwed them into the fascia so that the ladder would rest on the 2x4s instead of on the drip edge. There's a couple of screw holes that I'm going to need to fill in before I paint this, but that's no big deal compared to dented up drip edge. So I only had one problem when it came to shingling. What we're looking at here is a bundle of cap shingles. Well, I bought a couple of bundles to finish off the top of the roof, and what I didn't realize is that one of them was the wrong color. It was mixed up on the shelf, and when I opened up the package, it was a much lighter color than this charcoal that I needed for my roof. So I ended up having to go return it. And again, that boils down to me not paying attention and reading the marking that's on the side of the package here, which clearly stated what color the shingles were. So moral of the story, most of the mistakes that I made here were because I was rushing and not taking the time to think things through. So if you have any stories about construction mistakes that you'd like to share, feel free to put it in the comments section below. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more about my shed building project or learn about my channel, check the information in the description below. Thanks for watching.